Jack Harris had it all. At 38 years old, he was a successful general sales manager at a thriving tech company. His career was on the up and up, his family life appeared perfect, and he felt secure in the life they had built. He had a beautiful wife, Susie, who was 35, smart, and ambitious. Together, they had 2 young children, a 5-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter. Their home was filled with the sounds of laughter and warmth, a portrait of the ideal family. But as they say, appearances can be deceiving. Susie had recently returned to work after taking some time off to raise their children, and Jack, though busy with work, had noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She'd become a little more distant, a little more preoccupied. She spent longer hours at the office, and when she was home, her attention was split between her phone and her work, leaving Jack to manage the household and the children. Jack tried to brush off his concerns. After all, Susie was just adjusting to being back at work. They had a lot on their plates. However, there was something else, a strange tension that seemed to hang in the air whenever they were together. Their conversations, once filled with the ease of longtime partners, became stilted, uncomfortable. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He told himself it was nothing, that he was just being paranoid, but deep down he knew this nagging sense of unease was pointing to something darker. Little did Jack know, the perfect life he thought he had was about to shatter in a way he never imagined. The first sign of trouble came on an ordinary evening. Jack had been busy with work all day, but he made sure to carve out some time for his family. They had dinner together, and the children played as Susie and Jack sat down to talk. It was a quiet moment in the midst of their chaotic lives, but it was also when Jack noticed the mark on Susie's neck. It wasn't just a light bruise, it was a distinct, unmistakable hickey. His stomach dropped, and his mind raced. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The mark was too clear to be an accident, too clear to be ignored. Jack tried to remain calm, asking her where it had come from. Susie's response was evasive, a flimsy excuse about how she had been roughhousing with some friends at work. But Jack could feel his pulse quicken. This wasn't the Susie he knew. She hadn't even apologized. In fact, when Jack pressed her further, Susie became defensive, brushing him off as though his concerns were irrational. "It's no big deal, Jack," she said nonchalantly. "People get marks all the time." But Jack wasn't convinced. He'd seen those marks before, but never on her, never in the context of their marriage. His heart was racing now, the feeling of betrayal starting to sink in. Could it be true? Had Susie been hiding something from him all this time? The question loomed large in his mind, gnawing at him relentlessly. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed beside his wife, he couldn't escape the thought of her affair. Everything about their life, everything about their marriage, suddenly seemed like a lie. He had no proof yet, but his instincts told him that something had gone horribly wrong, and the only thing he could do now was find out exactly what that was. The confrontation was inevitable. Jack couldn't ignore it any longer. The hickey on Susie's neck was no longer just a mark, it was a glaring sign that something was terribly wrong. Jack's mind raced as he tried to process the weight of what he had discovered. But the truth was burning inside him, demanding to be faced. One evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Jack finally decided to confront Susie. His heart pounded in his chest as he asked the question that had been haunting him for days. "Where did that mark come from, Susie?" His voice was steady, though his insides churned with fear and anxiety. For a long moment, Susie remained silent. She looked at him with an expression that seemed distant, almost detached. Then, with a calm that unsettled Jack, she spoke the words he had feared the most. "Yes, Jack, I've been seeing Paul." Jack's stomach twisted, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Paul Jenkins. The name echoed in his ears like a death sentence. Paul was her boss, a man Jack had always known but never truly paid much attention to. He hadn't known that the man who had shared office space with Susie for so long had become a part of her life in such an intimate way. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The pain of hearing it from her lips was almost too much to bear. But the worst part was that Susie didn't even seem to care. She was calm, almost indifferent, as if she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. "It's been going on for a while, Jack," she said, her voice flat. "I'm not in love with you anymore, and I'm not going to end it. I'm with Paul now." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. How could this be happening? How could his wife, the mother of his children, so easily turn her back on everything they had built together? And yet there was no remorse in her voice, no hint of regret. She had already made her decision, and Jack was just a casualty in her path. He was nothing more than a part of the past she had already moved on from. For a moment, Jack didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. He had never imagined this could happen to him. How could Susie do this to him? To their children? Jack tried to absorb what had just happened, but the weight of Susie's confession crushed him. The woman he had loved for over a decade had not only betrayed him with someone he had trusted, but had also dismissed his pain as if it didn't matter. She was indifferent, almost cold, as if she had already made her peace with the affair long before Jack had even figured it out. In the days that followed, the reality of the betrayal set in. Susie's behavior grew more distant, and Jack could see that her focus was now entirely on Paul. She no longer made any effort to hide her affection for him. There were no apologies, no attempts to salvage what they had. Instead, she grew more defiant, more certain that she was doing what was best for her. It was as if Jack had never even been a part of her life. The more Jack tried to talk to her, the more she brushed him off. Her lack of remorse was crushing. "I'm sorry, Jack, but this is what I want," she told him one night, her voice devoid of emotion. "I don't want to be in this marriage anymore. I've been unhappy for a long time and I'm moving on. You should too." The words were like daggers, each one leaving a scar that Jack couldn't ignore. How had he missed the signs? How had he not seen that Susie was no longer the woman he had married? Was their marriage always this fragile? Was their life always this fragile? Jack couldn't escape the feeling of powerlessness. He wanted to fight for his family, for his children, but Susie had already made up her mind. He could see it in her eyes, the determination, the cold finality. She was done. And that knowledge was perhaps the hardest pill to swallow. The more Susie dismissed him, the more Jack's thoughts began to spiral. Was divorce the only option left? Could he really let her walk away from everything they had? The idea of starting over without her seemed impossible, but the alternative, living in a home where love no longer existed, felt unbearable. Jack was at a crossroads, but one thing was certain: he couldn't just let it go. He couldn't let Susie's betrayal be the final chapter of their story. He wasn't sure what he would do, but he knew that something had to change. He wasn't ready to walk away yet. In the days that followed Susie's confession, Jack found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, heartbreak, and disbelief. Each day felt like he was walking through a fog, unable to fully grasp the reality of what had happened. His mind replayed every moment with Susie, every conversation, every smile, wondering how he could have missed the signs. Had he really been so blind? Or had he simply ignored the cracks in their marriage, hoping they would heal on their own? The weight of betrayal consumed him. Jack went through the motions of his day, but everything felt hollow. He continued to go to work, to be a father to his children, but inside he was unraveling. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, haunted by visions of Susie and Paul together. The thought of his wife in another man's arms, of their intimate moments being shared with someone else, gnawed at him like a constant ache in his chest. The worst part was the feeling of being powerless. Jack had always been the one in control, successful at work, confident in his personal life, but now he felt like a shell of the man he once was. Every time he looked at Susie, he saw not the woman he had married, but a stranger, someone who had made a choice to abandon everything they had built together. Jack tried to talk to her, to reason with her, to ask her to reconsider, but each conversation ended the same way, with Susie growing more distant, more resolute. Her decision was final. She had moved on, and there was no place for him in her future. That finality was like a punch to the gut, a constant reminder that the life Jack had known was gone, and there was no way to get it back. But even as he wallowed in his pain, a darker feeling began to take root. Resentment, revenge, the desire for justice began to overshadow his sorrow, and Jack found himself consumed by thoughts of making Paul pay for what he had taken from him. He wasn't sure what that would look like, he wasn't sure what he was capable of, but the more Susie dismissed him, the more Jack's desire for revenge grew. The idea of revenge began as a fleeting thought, a momentary fantasy that Jack could easily dismiss. But the more he thought about it, the more it became an obsession. He couldn't let Paul get away with this. He couldn't let Susie destroy their family without some form of payback. Jack had to do something that would make Paul regret ever crossing him, something that would make Susie see just how much she had lost. Jack began his investigation into Paul Jenkins. At first, it was just casual checking his social media, looking for anything that might give him a clue about Paul's life outside of work. But soon, it grew darker. He started digging into Paul's past, asking questions, looking for skeletons in the closet. What he found shocked him. Paul wasn't just a high-powered businessman, he had ties to the Mexican Cartel, a criminal organization Jack never imagined would be part of his world. The more Jack uncovered, the deeper the rabbit hole went. It wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about power, manipulation, and control. Paul had used Susie, and in the process, had become a part of something far more dangerous. Jack's anger began to take shape. This wasn't about getting back at Susie anymore, this was about destroying everything Paul had built, ruining the life he had created. Jack knew that getting involved with the cartel was risky, but at that point he didn't care. His emotions, his desire for vengeance, had overridden his sense of caution. He began making connections, reaching out to people who knew the cartel's inner workings, people who could help him get closer to Paul, people who could make him pay for what he had done. But even as Jack's plan took shape, doubt crept into his mind. Was he really willing to risk everything, his job, his family, his freedom for revenge? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The man he had once been, the loving husband, the father, was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to do anything to make Paul suffer. Jack wasn't sure what the end game would look like, but one thing was certain: revenge was no longer just a fantasy. It was a reality he was willing to pursue, no matter the cost. As Jack's obsession with revenge deepened, he began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. His once orderly, predictable life was now consumed by the dark pull of vengeance. At work, he was distant, his mind often wandering to thoughts of Paul and the cartel, the plans he was secretly crafting. He couldn't focus on anything else. His colleagues noticed, but Jack brushed off their concerns, hiding behind his smile and easygoing nature, pretending that everything was normal. But nothing was normal. At home, Jack became even more withdrawn. He no longer engaged with Susie the way he once did. Their conversations had turned bitter, filled with cold words and a growing sense of animosity. She, too, seemed to have changed. She was living her new life, often coming and going without a second glance at Jack. Their children, once the center of Jack's world, seemed like distant strangers. He loved them, of course, but the growing rage inside him overshadowed everything. In the midst of this emotional chaos, Jack reached out to people who could connect him with the cartel's inner circle. He began making deals and forming alliances with dangerous people, people who didn't care about right or wrong, only power. Jack's hands, once clean and steady, were now stained with the dirt of the underworld. Each new step brought him closer to Paul, closer to the moment when he could make Paul pay for the suffering he had caused. The more Jack became involved in the cartel's world, the more he realized how far he was willing to go. He had always been a man of principles, someone who held his family above all else, but now his sense of right and wrong had blurred. Revenge was no longer just a need, it had become an obsession, a driving force in his life. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, but the thought of confronting Paul and seeing the fear in his eyes kept him going. Jack's descent into this world was a slow burn. It wasn't sudden, but rather a gradual shift, where each small choice built upon the last, until he found himself tangled in a web he couldn't escape. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. But the question still haunted him, was this really what he wanted? Was this the kind of man he had become? The night came when everything Jack had been building toward reached a boiling point. He had gathered the information he needed, made the right connections, and arranged the final details. He was ready. His plan to get back at Paul was set in motion, and there was no turning back now. His hands shook with anticipation, but also with the knowledge of what he had become, a man capable of unthinkable actions, all in the name of revenge. But the closer Jack came to executing his plan, the more he started to question everything. As he stood in front of a darkened hotel room, preparing for the confrontation that would change everything, a small voice inside his head whispered the words he had been trying to silence. What about your children? What about Susie? Jack paused. For the first time in months, he thought about his kids. His son who needed him, and his daughter, who was still too young to understand the chaos unfolding around them. What would happen to them if he went through with this? Would they be left with nothing but a broken man who had lost his humanity in the pursuit of vengeance? The voice of reason, once so easy to ignore, now echoed louder. Jack had been consumed by his own anger, but in that moment he saw what he was about to throw away. His family, his future, his integrity. Standing there on the brink of destroying everything, Jack realized that revenge would never bring him peace. It would only continue to consume him. Paul would suffer, but what about Jack? What about the man he used to be, the man who loved his family, who believed in doing the right thing? Jack walked away that night. He didn't follow through with his plan. He couldn't. His children needed him. Susie, though she had betrayed him, was still the mother of his children, and despite everything, Jack couldn't let them be caught in the crossfire of his rage. The decision to walk away was the hardest one Jack had ever made, but in the end he knew it was the only way to preserve whatever was left of his soul. In the weeks following Jack's decision to abandon his quest for revenge, he found himself struggling to rebuild the pieces of his life. The damage caused by Susie's affair, the emotional scars, were still fresh, but something within him had shifted. The rage that had once consumed him had started to dissipate, replaced by a quiet resignation and a sense of responsibility that he couldn't ignore. Jack had to face the reality that his marriage was over. Susie's indifference toward him, her firm resolve to stay with Paul, made it clear that there was no path back to what they once had. Jack accepted that he couldn't change her, no matter how much he wanted to. The more he tried to convince himself that they could work things out, the more he realized that the woman he had known as partner, the mother of his children, was no longer the same. She had chosen her path, and it was no longer alongside him. But the decision to walk away from revenge didn't mean Jack had let go of everything. He still had his children to raise, his job to focus on, and his dignity to rebuild. He chose to focus on what mattered most: his family, his own healing, and his future. It wasn't easy. The nights were still long and filled with the echoes of Susie's betrayal, but Jack had found a new sense of purpose. He sought therapy, both for himself and for his children. The sessions were hard, uncomfortable at times, but Jack knew they were necessary. The anger that had threatened to swallow him whole slowly began to fade, replaced by an understanding of the damage it could do not just to Paul, but to his own life, to his children. The journey of healing was slow, but Jack was determined. He realized that he was not the man he had been before all of this, but perhaps that was for the best. The old Jack, the one who had been blinded by love and trust, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, more aware of the world's complexities. Susie, meanwhile, moved forward with her life, still with Paul, still unchanged. Jack's path no longer intertwined with hers, and though the sight of her moved him with a mix of bitterness and sorrow, he didn't chase her anymore. He couldn't. He had his own life to rebuild now, one piece at a time. Jack's journey was one of profound pain and personal transformation. The road he walked was neither quick nor easy, but in the end it was a road toward self-discovery and healing. His quest for revenge had almost destroyed him, but it was in choosing to let go of that destructive path that he began to regain control of his life. As he watched his children grow and saw the small but meaningful moments of joy re-enter his world, Jack realized that some things were worth fighting for things that couldn't be bought with revenge or anger. He had learned the hard way that the cost of betrayal was high, but the cost of holding on to vengeance was even higher. Revenge might have offered momentary satisfaction, but it would have left him hollow in the end. Jack knew he would never forget the pain Susie had caused him, but he had come to accept that holding on to that pain wasn't going to bring him peace. In walking away from revenge, he had found something far more valuable: the ability to move forward, to rebuild, and to show up for his children as the man he needed to be. The story of Jack's pain and transformation wasn't about revenge or betrayal, it was about finding a way to rise above it. And though it wasn't the story Jack had once envisioned, it was his story, and it was one he was determined to finish on his own terms. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your feedback and any insights you may have. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one. Stay tuned for more.